Si je m'épanche sur toi, c'est que
For
je
this
rêve
month's lingerie
de toi.
design,
Oui,
I
du
decided to go
soir.
back in time again and use another pattern that's vintage but has been put back in the books. This is Simplicity 8510. It's a 1930s pattern of a bralette and a little tap pant. It has two versions on the tap pant. One has an applied yoke. It's not an actual yoke. It's just applied on, so it's strictly decorative in the front only. So it's a pretty straightforward pattern. It's just one little bralette and one little tap pant with or without an applied yoke. However, I am going to pull back out all that peach satin. I have so much of it. I'm just going to keep using it till it's gone for these patterns. And it looks really pretty in these vintage designs. And I have another lovely lace. So we're going to be doing some lace applique on this, on the bralette and on the little tap pant. I'm mostly going to sew this up at the sewing machine also because it is a vintage pattern. We're going to kind of sew it in a vintage way before sergers. The other thing you're going to need, besides your pretty fabric and your pattern, the other thing you're going to need are buttons. I've just gone to my stash. I'm using things I have. I'm not going to the store for this at all. And I've just pulled out buttons. I have 3 different kinds here. This one is a peach that matches almost perfectly. It says 1/2 inch button is what it recommends. These are all in the 3/8 or right below a half. So these are the buttons. I don't know which one I'm going to use, but these are the ones I pulled out. It'll be one of these. So we're ready to cut. We're ready to make some tap pants. The first thing we're going to do is take our fronts and our backs on the waistline, and we're just going to do a little stay stitching, which is just a little basting line, and that's because there's so much bias in it. It just preserves the integrity. I'm going to back up so you can see the shape of this. You can see how tiny the waist is compared to the hip. This is a very flared, full through the hip pant. It should fit lots of people. It's meant just to be full, but the nice thing is if you're full, it's got a little extra room in it. So we're going to do our little stay stitch. After that, we're going to go ahead and put together a right and a left leg. So you put your right leg on top of your left leg, front right on back right, front left on back left, and sew them together underneath at the little crotch line. And then there is a, here it is. See this little mark? We're going to sew the side seam up to that point on both of these. And we need to seam finish, and I'll show you. I think I'm going to do French seams on those. I'm going to look and see what they clip it. So we're going to clip and make a French seam on both of those. This is 100% going to be done on the sewing machine. No serging this go around. This is the inseam here. You can see I just made a mock French seam. That's what it's going to look like. I will tell you that the synthetic satins are a little hard to work with. Look at all the pins I have on this side. It just does not want to stay where it belongs. It just pops right back out. But once it's sewn and pressed, it'll be fine. And I actually am having a hard enough time to press it first. Usually I press it and then sew it, and it's just not working as well with the satin. Ugh, I can see a little bubble there. I need to repin. After you've sewn your straight seam, let me put my little marking where to sew to. And I've sewn my seam on the outside. This is the outside leg, the side seam. You're going to make a little clip right at that mark. So you can see I'm going to make a little clip. This is what it looks like here. Up to the stitching, you have to be really careful. You want to be right at that stitching line. Below that's where you're going to do your French seam, your flat felled seam, your zigzag, whatever you choose to do for your seam finish. Above it, this is going to get opened up, and we have a facing type strip we're going to put along there. So I'm going to finish both of these, and then we're going to slide our legs into each other and do the crotch. So that's coming up next. These are so slippery. So here's a pant leg. This is my pretty little seam from the outside. This is what it looks like on the inside. They are really pretty when you do a French seam or a flat felled seam, or in this case it's a mock French. The side seam is going to look like this. So we have raw still at the top up to the clip, and then here's my self-finished seam at the bottom. So I'm going to take this one that is right side out, and I'm going to slide it into this one that is wrong side out, and we're going to line them up along the crotch seam. So I've got, here's my the inside leg seam, and I'm just going to line that on top of each other like this. And then my backs should line up with each other. And my fronts will line up with each other. And I'm going to sew this U. Let me put a couple pins in it for you. We're going to sew that U around, and then we have to decide how we want to seam finish this. They don't really discuss that too much in the pattern about what kind of seam finish you want to do. One of the options would be to bias bind it, which I kind of am considering doing. So see, here's my seam that I'm going to be sewing. So here's a U. So I'm going to sew that U. It's open on the sides here because it flaps open. It's interesting. The little side has a flap and the flap folds down. That's how these work. This is an old-fashioned undie. So we're going to sew that U around, and then I need to make a decision about how I want to finish that U. So we'll talk about that when I come back. I have a feeling I have so much of this satin. I think I'm just going to cut a strip of the satin and do a little bias binding. I think that's going to look the nicest as far as how it finishes off, and it will be very comfortable to wear as well. I am also going to go ahead and do my rolled hem on my legs. You're just doing a tiny little folded up hem on both legs. I'm going to go ahead and do that because I want to apply a lace, and I need the hem in first, and then I can apply the lace over the top of it. The lace can go in at the very end because I'm just going around the bottom of both legs, but I think I'm going to go ahead and do the hem. It's frays just enough that anything I can finish off, I'm going to. I'm going to do my crotch seam, my big U, and I'm going to go ahead and hem my legs. And then I will show you, I'm going to cut my strip of bias, and I'll show you how I apply that to that crotch seam. This is my inseam that I just sewed, the crotch seam, and I'm going to trim out some of the excess because you don't want a real wide seam in that area before I add my bias edging. So I'm going to put bias around it to finish off that edge, which will be really pretty, but I'm going to trim off this little bit real quick. This is how it looks as I begin putting the bias onto my trimmed out seam. So you can see, and then I'm just going to stitch it on. The goal is to get it around the seam and close to, but not over the original stitching line, so that it doesn't make any bulk at the actual seam line from the outside. It's taken some time, but I have finally pinned in all the way around my bias, so I'm going to go now and stitch it up. Just a quick look at the hem, and all I have done is I've turned up and stitched my first line, and then I'm folding it over and stitching again. This is what it looks like on the inside. This is what it looks like on the outside before I add the lace. But it would be very pretty just left like that. All right, my pants are together at the crotch seam. Let me just find, here's my outer seam. Here's my hem. And you can see this is the bias that I put on the inside to cover that inner crotch seam, or that U. So now we're ready to do, if you're not doing the yoke, it is step 16, which is applying pattern piece 11 above our side seam. So this is where we made our little clip, and this is pattern piece 11 right here, and we're putting right sides together, and I've just pinned it on so it looks like this. These little markings are actually buttonhole markings that I just put the little dots so I'll know where they go later. And this is what it looks like. So I'm going to sew this straight across. You're just going to do your 5/8 inch seam and see where we've clipped. You're going to come right across the top of this, but not actually catching it. You're just going right next to it, all the way across. And then this is going to get folded and flipped around, and it's going to cover up that old stitching. So let me stitch this in real quick, and I'll show you the next part. So our lap is sewn on. This is going to be on the inside where our buttonholes and buttons are also going to go through the part of this. So now that I've got it sewn to the pants, I'm going to turn up the other edge, our 5/8, press that down, and then that's going to come over like so. And we're just going to whip stitch it down across, and that is going to completely enclose all of that. So I'm going to press and pin and whip stitch. So here it is pressed. This is what it looks like on the other side now. And now that I've got my little things pressed up, my seam allowances, we're just going to fold over like this and whip stitch it down. I'm going to put a few pins in it, and it's ready to go. And of course this is all on the inside. And when I whip stitch, I go through this folded edge and then I'll pick up one of my stitches here and I just go back and forth around all the way across like this. This is how the little side piece looks once it's stitched on, inside and outside. And now we're going to come and do our little waistbands. In the front, they're really little bindings. There's not much to them. In the front, you're going to tuck under, so you're going to fold back the little flap for the front waistband. And this is, the buttonhole is going to go through that, but you won't see it in the front. And in the back, and then, so here's my binding. It hangs off just a little bit. It says 3/8 of an inch seam allowance is what they recommend for this. Now they had us baste this at 5/8, so I'm a little confused about why they had us baste at 5/8 if they're going to have us throw the binding on at 3/8. But either way, that's what the little directions say. And in the back, when you go to do your waistband, the little flaps stay out. You don't fold them back for the back because they have to tuck behind with our little buttons on them. So then this is going to get sewn across. So we're just going to straight stitch this on with the sewing machine so that we can then tuck under this, fold over, and whip stitch it down. So this is going to be our little binding. It's teeny tiny little binding waistbands, which will be really cute. This is the, I can't remember if I showed you, but this is the bias on the inside of the crotch line that I did. And then we also have our mock French seams. Now I'm also going to do this. This is my lace that I'm going to add to the hemline, and I'm just pinning it on, starting at the inseam, inside underneath the crotch where it can't be seen. That's where we're going to start and stop our lace. And I am lining up my lace so that the scallop just hangs off of where I've already hemmed it. So it's, you can see here's my pretty little hem, and the scallop's just going to hang off like that, and I'm just going to top stitch this around, and that's going to be the lace along the bottom edge of this, which I think will be really pretty. Now you could even add lace at the waist if you wanted to before you put your binding on. If you could do, I almost did this, you could do the little lace where they do the little bias like this, and you just have a little V at the corner. So there's lots of options for how you want to do your lace, but I'm going to do the straightforward and simple little hem edge like that. So I'm going to apply this. I'm going to put both of these on, getting them ready for hand stitching, and then I'll be back to show you the hand stitching and do buttonholes and buttons. Look at how pretty that lace looks on there. That's just lovely. There's just no other word for it. I like it. So now that I have the lace along the bottom, that's hemmed, all that's left are these little waistbands before I do the buttonholes and buttons. Now I've sewn on the waist binding at the 5/8 inch, and I'm supposed to turn up. It says turn up 3/8 of an inch, which is about like that, and then this whole thing's going to flip around and enclose that. But in order to do that, I need to trim out some of this. There's a lot in here, more than this little waistband is going to allow me to use. So I'm going to trim out this waistband down to about 1/4 of an inch using my favorite little duckbill scissors here. I'm going to trim this down, and then we'll pin it and stitch it. And I'm just going to say, when I get ready to do this, I'm going to fold this back like this too. And I kind of regret I didn't go ahead and just fold it when I stitched it. I don't know why I didn't. I wasn't thinking. So this is the back, because the little flap is open. In the front, the little flap is pulled back.
Les étoiles de minuit s'installent au-dessus des toits de Paris. C'est pour toi. Si les étoiles de minuit s'emballent.
This is going to get folded like this, so that when this comes around, now you can see how this tucked like that and folded again, and that's our little tiny waist binding. Isn't that pretty? Now you could top stitch that down, or I'm going to whip stitch it personally, but that's how we're going to do for both little waists. So I'm going to just treat both of them the same way. We're going to fold back these little edges when we get ready to do it, so that's all finished off and pretty. And I'll be back in a little bit to show you the finished little waist bindings and do buttonholes and buttons. Here's a little quick close-up of the buttonholes and buttons and how they look on the side, and you can see the little tiny waist binding. So that's how that looks when it's done. Here's the one that's all buttoned up. Very pretty. So here it is finished, both pieces. I like the pattern a lot. I think that in some ways it's a little complicated just because there's a lot of tiny pieces on it, a lot of handwork in this pattern, but it is a vintage pattern. I think the lace application added a lot to the design. I think that's just pretty and feminine and delicate, and it looks very vintage. And it didn't add a lot of time as far as construction goes, so I like the lace a lot. I think it turned out really pretty. So here's our finished ensemble. It took us 2 videos to get here, but I think it turned out really pretty. See you next week for another fun video.
Toi de Paris, c'est pour toi.